Behind every success story, there is a long line of triumphs and defeats that remain hidden from others. These stories get condensed into journeys that minimize the struggle and wrap up with a happy ending. But we know that's not how life works. That's where From the Ashes with Mark Azoulay comes in. On today's show, you'll hear honest conversations about the challenges that Mark's guest faced and how they overcame adversity. Now, here is your host, Mark Azoulay.
Welcome back to From the Ashes. I'm your host, Mark Azoulay, and I'm here with Gutierrez, who's a serial entrepreneur, mental health advocate, and just really an eclectic individual. What stood out to me about you is that you work with a lot of intuition, helping people to tap into the intuition that they have, and I'm curious to dive into that with you. So welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
Yeah, so as we start off this segment, we want to hear your From the Ashes story, right? Your failure to success story, how you overcame a challenge, how you brought it into your life. So take it away. Sure.
So my story really begins, I think, in being diagnosed ADHD in my early 30s. I was returning back to school to get my master's in social work, and I knew something was off. And I said, you know what, I'm too old to waste my time. And I wanted to do it right. And I said, okay, I thought I might have had some type of learning disability or something of that nature. And after 6 hours, over 2 days, I walked out with an ADHD diagnosis, and my world changed, really. After being pissed off for about 3 months of that diagnosis and saying, if I only knew, that survivor, that thriver in me kicked in and said, okay, well, if this is the deal, then what are we going to make with this? Because this is what we have to work with. And really that set the stage for me in creating the businesses that I have now, and really applying what I learned, not only about myself, but about neurodiversity in general and how that affects entrepreneurship and just the world in general. How many adults are not diagnosed? How many are diagnosed only when their children are diagnosed? And all of those years of not really understanding or blaming yourself or thinking that there was something wrong with you, when really it's just that we process the world differently.
Yeah, that's a great topic. So can you walk me back a little bit and tell me what your experience was like when your ADHD was undiagnosed, like what your mind was like, what it was like to focus, like what were your symptoms? How did you live?
I didn't know I had any, let's put it that way.
Yeah, I thought it was who you are, right?
Yeah, exactly. And because ADHD shows up very different in women than it does in men. So at the time, I'm 43 now. So, 30 years ago, we didn't have the understanding that we have today in regards to neurodiversity and how the variety of really what that presents in the world with. So for me, I kind of consider myself, Pigpen from the Peanuts, that kind of like little orbiting dirt. Mine wasn't dirt. Yeah, but it was a bit of a cloud of chaos, right? The story that I like to share is, and I laugh about it now, but my mom used to find my keys in the freezer when she would come home from school. Or when she would come home from work. I had gone into the freezer from school. I had the keys in my hand. I forgot them. That was kind of the chaos that took place. And so I remember I was in high school, and here in Canada, I don't know what sophomore, junior, I know Americans have a very specific way where those land. I'm not too sure, but it was grade 11 for me. Mm-hmm. I took math 7 times, grade 11 math 7 times. And at no point did someone say, what's wrong? I wasn't a kid that, skipped class or called out attention or was a troublemaker, which really that would have been what might have been thought of ADHD back then. But something was clearly off. I was always volunteering for stuff because I couldn't sit still. But I just thought I just get bored easy. I didn't really kind of put the 2 and 2 together. So when I was about 18 or 19, I said to myself, I can't live with this chaos, thinking it was a personal defect. So I really started picking up every book that I could, every magazine, every blog on getting organized that I could possibly find. I thought stickers and color coding and a good binder was going to fix my life. It absolutely didn't, but it did give me some skills that would come in handy later on. And really, it was just, it's difficult to put into words the disappointment in yourself when you're like, this is important, I'm going to get this done. And somehow that importance just slips through your fingers. It's a very, very frustrating. And when you don't know what it is, the only, lens that you have is to turn it inwards and say, well, then it's me.
Yeah. That really resonates. So I'm in recovery from drug addiction, and I work with a lot of people that are. And I think of the parallels there of making a promise to yourself to not use or to, show up at a place on time or whatever it is, right? And then to break that promise, it can very quickly turn into shame.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's not only shame, but the consequences of that, right? The missed opportunities, the lack of trust that people have in you, the shoulds can build up really quickly. And also the fact that neurodiversity shows up so differently for everybody, right? For some people, it might be something very physical. For other people, it might be something very internal, right? I know as women, we're conditioned, well, at least of a certain age, we're conditioned in a way of presenting a certain face to the world. No one knows that I'm moving, but I'm moving right now, right? My toes are moving constantly. If I'm in a business meeting, I present not as anxious as I actually am. So, you condition yourself to fit into a world that doesn't understand you with certain coping mechanisms. You brought up being in recovery. Substance abuse is a big thing in the ADHD community, right? It's a way of regulating yourself, even if you don't understand what you're actually doing. Yeah.
So what's the internal experience? Like, is it discomfort? You mentioned nervous or anxiety. Like what's...
So I'm also diagnosed with anxiety. So that's a condition that I share with ADHD. But for me, it's a level of creativity that very few people understand. The racing of the mind, the inability to complete a thought to the end. And I have my own podcast, and I always warn my guests, I'm so sorry, because if I get excited about the topic, I'm going to be jumping because my mind starts firing off, and I'm unable to complete where I really wanted to go with it. Kind of like what I shared with you before we started. My style is very organic. It's more to cope with my ADHD than anything else, because the reality is that as much as I want to stay on topic, that's a very difficult thing for me. The interrupting people. That's one that I have not been able to find a coping mechanism for. And I think it's just, I found for me that internal experience very much was boiled down to shame, but also comparison. I'm just so different from everyone else, right? And so that fitting in, that self-esteem really starts to take a hit with that.
Yeah, so the loneliness too, of feeling like you can't really connect with others.
Absolutely. And I think that's why for me, I've become really passionate about ADHD and entrepreneurship, because it is an avenue for people that have this to not feel so lonely. 72% of entrepreneurs suffer from either a diagnosed or undiagnosed mental illness, and over 50% of that is a neurodiverse condition. So it's kind of the area that we end up kind of floating to, because we don't really fit into a regular work environment, or it's just too challenging, the certain requirements that other people can easily manage to meet.
Yeah, can you say more about that? Because I imagine, I know that is way more prevalent than in Gen Pop, right?
Absolutely.
So say more about that draw to entrepreneurship or business ownership, leadership.
So, as a mental wellness advocate for entrepreneurship specifically, I think it's something that people don't actually understand number one, who's drawn to entrepreneurship, and also why they're drawn. A lot of people, I think, become unwilling entrepreneurs, not so much because they're excited to start their own business, but because they can't find a job or they can't keep a job in a regular way. But it also ties into some other, not conditions, but other factors that play a role in ADHD. So, for example, higher tolerance to risk, right? It's a risky thing running your own business, and having ADHD, you tend to have a higher threshold for risk as well. You just seem to not keep it in mind enough. It's kind of like a fleeting thought, like all the other thoughts. At the same time, the creativity, kind of having an outlet, the erratic hours. So ADHD plays a big role in sleeping issues. So you might be awake at night and sleep, not wake up till maybe 10 in the morning, 11 in the morning, right? It's difficult to find a job that adjusts to that. Entrepreneurship might be great because, you're working well into the night. Doesn't mean it's healthy. But again, I look at it as more of a survival for some people than actually understanding what they're getting into with entrepreneurship and ADHD. But, entrepreneurship has a lot of risk factors that make, whether it's ADHD or any type of other mental illness, exacerbate it. And that's why I'm so passionate about really bringing that message, because I don't really think people understand the epidemic levels that entrepreneurship has when it comes to the detriments of mental illness. So all of those factors that I mentioned beforehand, uncertainty, high risk tolerance, not caring what other people think, thinking that, I say that it's almost like we think that we're oracles. We're so convinced of our vision and what we have in mind. And you need that in entrepreneurship. But, that can alienate a lot of people, right? That doesn't make a good friend when you're looking at relationships. So there's a lot of different factors that we actually don't realize how that plays out in our lives. So entrepreneurship, we're 4 times more likely to take our own life, right, than the general population. And so it's something that, it's great. We think that entrepreneurs are the modern day superheroes, and everyone's like, I want to run my own business. And it's like, really? Do you have the fire in your belly for not getting paid for 6 months? Not a lot of people do, right? And you're dragging your family along with it, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, high risk, high reward, and a lot of failure, right? A lot of coping with failure and failing forward.
Absolutely. So, it's the only, I call it the club that in order to join it, you have to fail.
For sure.
Continuously. Otherwise entrepreneurs like, we don't trust, like, you haven't actually earned your chops if you haven't had like a failed business or bankruptcy under your belt type of thing. So it's harsh for sure. Yeah.
It's so much about coping with failure, hanging in there. Right. And then decision making, which I'd imagine an individual with ADHD, like, decisions are so quick. Right. I remember reading some study where they looked at successful versus unsuccessful CEOs across a million different metrics. And the only one that had any kind of correlation was time to make decisions. Right. The people that were quicker to make decisions tended to be more successful.
But at the same time, then you got to look at decision fatigue. So yes, you're quick to make those decisions. But if you're making 1,000 decisions a day, and we do, right? That's why you see these really successful CEOs wear the same outfit every day, because they don't want the decision of what's going to match with my gray pants type of thing. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I want to bring it a little bit back to your story, right? You said you got this diagnosis. You had like 3 or 4 months of just like, oh my God, what the heck is this?
Absolutely.
And then you started to turn around. So can you talk about that turnaround moment?
So what happened was, going back to when I was 19 and I had started really researching and finding out, all these different ways of getting organized. Now that I had my diagnosis, and I recommend to anyone that even mildly suspects, getting a proper diagnosis, because the proper diagnosis will tell you what type of ADHD you have, what are what are the skills that are your strongest and your weakest? Yes, they put it in the context of learning, but you can easily translate that to the rest of your life, right? So like, for example, my diagnosis spoke to my abnormally obsessive attention to detail. So that meant that my color coding actually deterred me from properly learning and paying attention, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And you think, what do you think? Getting organized. What's the first thing that people think of? It's that, and you see these videos of the organizers on Netflix, the home edit and all that, and it's their rainbows and colors and all that stuff. And that was the first thing that they took away from me. So really what it did was it took the skills that I had been building over the previous 10 plus years. It gave me the lens to look at them properly. And so all of a sudden it was like they were on steroids. And all of this hard work that I had been putting into myself, thinking I'm just not good enough and trying, all of a sudden made sense. And I could properly channel it in a way. And then that translated over because at that time I was in school. I fell out of love with my program, but I had started a small business in the meantime, just for some extra cash that grew. And that is one of the businesses that I run today. And it's about getting entrepreneurs organized in their business. So I really took something that was a challenge and it's grown into a passion because not a passion because I like color coding and straight lines and things of that nature. A passion because I see how many people are struggling in the same way that I was, and seeing that the entrepreneurial community is filled with this need. I love the idea of being able to equip people to find the peace in their life that they're missing. Because I think that if there's one thing that I can describe ADHD when not managed properly is it robs you of your peace. And anybody that lacks peace, I think you're missing everything at that point.
Absolutely. Yeah. It kind of treads into the spiritual waters that you also talk about.
Absolutely.
An intuitive life. Can you say a little bit about that? A sense of inner peace?
So for me, intuition is part of my life. It has been a part of my life ever since I can remember. And it is a pillar of a program that I've developed for entrepreneurs in finding help in the emotional impacts that entrepreneurship has that no one talks about. That's how important it is, because I think that, and I don't mean to be trite or naive when I say this, but I think that if we lived in a world where people would listen to their intuition more and be taught to listen to their intuition more, we would have a very different world to live in. I think that the biggest disservice that we do as humans is to be taught that we can't trust that voice within. I'm so fascinated with the topic that I've started a podcast on it. It's called The Voice Within, and it's all about how intuition shows up in people's lives, because I really think that that intuition is so different for everyone, yet we share it. It's something that we all have in common. And I really think that when we don't listen to it, it's when we find that things start to go awry in our life.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating topic. And I think I want to dive into it more around the role of intuition in business and how you can make decisions.
Yeah.
But before you go to the break, I'm curious, how does intuition show up for you? Like, is it a voice? Is it a feeling? Is it a vision, right? Like, what is your relationship with that inner voice?
So for me, it's a voice. And that's exactly why I named my podcast The Voice Within, because for me, it's a very tangible voice that I hear in my head and I have since childhood. It took me many years to realize what it was, but and I think, and my tagline for one of my businesses is, my hope is that the clearest voice that you hear is the one from within, because I think that, one of my goals in life is to empower everyone to be able to empower themselves by listening to that voice.
Yeah, I think that's really great. And yeah, we're going to go to a commercial break now, but I want to hear more about the techniques you use to let people get in touch with it, right? Because
absolutely,
I'm a psychotherapist, and you said you have a social work background, and there's this thing of like, hey, be yourself, do what feels right, but there's not a lot of education about how to actually do that, right?
Or discernment. or discernment, right? And I think that's super important. But we'll talk about it once the break comes up.
Exactly. Yeah. So we're going to move into our commercial break. When we get back, we'll dive into this topic a little bit more. So if you're listening, thanks for hanging in there, and we'll see you on the other side.
Become our friend on Facebook. Post your thoughts about our shows and network on our timeline. Visit facebook.com/Voice America.
In Mark's work with high performers and business owners, it is becoming increasingly clear to him that their biggest obstacle to success is themselves. They are experts in their field, but are dragged down by their anxiety, poor time management, inability to focus, or self-sabotage. His role is to help you overcome these emotional and organizational issues so that you can truly excel in your business and your personal life. One of the most common hurdles that he sees is perfectionism, a crippling anxiety around performance. It's a fear of not being good enough, being publicly embarrassed, or of disappointing others. These fears paralyze brilliant people and bring them to their knees. This course will help you to break free from this mental prison and have more agency in your world. In this online course, we will break down the prison of perfectionism so that you can break out of it. For more information and to sign up, visit mark-azulay.teachable.com. That's Mark, MARC-Azulay, AZOULAY.teachable.com.
It's your world. Motivate, change, succeed. VoiceAmericaEmpowerment.com.
You are listening to From the Ashes with Mark Azulay. To reach the show today, please call 1-888-346-9141. That's 1-888-346-9141. Or send an email to podcast@mark-azulay.com. Now, back to From the Ashes.
Welcome back to the show. We just stumbled upon a fantastic topic, which is intuition in business, right? And listening to those inner voices. And I'm really interested in this, right? Because just so you know a little about me, my background is I'm both a Buddhist practitioner and a psychoanalyst. So with those two combined, there's like, on the one hand, the Buddhist practice is to get into those thoughts, to develop a listening practice of the mind, right? But then also to kind of dismiss them in some ways, right? And then psychoanalysis both talks about the intuitive voice, but also talks about conditioning or trauma or, voices that could be self-sabotaging or procrastinating or whatever. So you mentioned at the end of the last segment that discernment is really critical, and I can't agree more. So my question for you is, I guess, one, do you agree with that assumption? And two, how can you differentiate between an intuitive voice and, a self-limiting belief or a trauma voice or something like that?
So I actually, I teach a workshop on intuition development, specifically covering these topics. So I'm so glad that you asked. So a couple of things. I always tell people, if you want to get really good at your intuition, you got to do the work. You got to do the work of knowing thyself, because those traumas, those limiting beliefs become filters with which that intuition comes through. So I say to people, if there are areas that are really traumatic in your life, you might never be able to trust your intuition in those areas unless you do an extensive amount of work. And I'm not saying it's not possible, but as a psychoanalyst, that there's not a lot of people that are really willing to go down that rabbit hole,
right?
Because that is a rabbit hole that takes you in directions that you don't know, and it's not always comfortable, and it's a lot of effort.
It's years of work minimum.
It absolutely it is. Yeah. And so when people come to my workshop, I say this is a starting point, but this is the starting of you building the relationship with your intuition, but is absolutely not the end all be all. I give them tools for them to walk away, but you have work to do on your own. So discernment, because, the example that I give is I was raised by a single mom. So my heart goes out to every single mother story that I ever hear in any and every situation. And so my discernment, out the window it goes. So I I'm honest enough. And I think that that's a key, is being honest with yourself, of recognizing what you're really not good at, or what is a part where you're like, you know what? There are feelings that get in the way. And I love how you said about your Buddhist practice in regards to those attachments, because I think that we get attached not only to the good, but we get attached to the trauma. We get attached to the sadness. We get attached to that grief. And it's going to block our intuition when you really, when you don't do the work and you just kind of let it sit around there. So that's part of it. The other part of it is asking. That's really important. A lot of people don't do that. You just kind of think that somebody that works with intuition just sits there and it comes. No, it's not just a passive experience. Yes, it can be just a passive experience. Like, let's say you're crossing the train tracks and all of a sudden you're like, I need to boot it. I need to press the gas and go. That might be a passive experience of intuition saying the train is coming, right? But if you really want to get good at it, you want to ask the questions that you're wanting to work on, right? So asking for that guidance, right? Setting up an environment that you start to build the practice of quieting yourself to hear that guidance, right? And I think the third tip that I would give people that I think is one of the most underused ones is when you hear that guidance in your head, right? When you hear a voice, because we hear many voices in our head, they might be thoughts, they might be ideas, as you get older, it might be your parents' voice that you're like, oh my God, I can't believe that this is there. I never wanted to, those times where you're like, I turned into my parents type of thing. That's their energy. That's kind of become part of your energy too, right? So what I say is ask who that voice belongs to, because you'll actually get an answer, right? And practice. I always tell people, start with simple things. I give exercises like, traffic. Should I take this route or that route, right? Start to figure out what your individual intuitive language is. What it is for me is absolutely not the same as what it is for you. So you really need to start to develop what that vocabulary looks like for you personally.
Yeah, so it's really developing a relationship with your mind and with your intuition. And it sounds like, to bring back the original topic, also with neurodiversity, right? Of knowing that some things are going to be unique, some things probably aren't going to change, or if they do, they're going to change really slowly. And it's more about developing a relationship with it rather than wishing it was different or trying to force it to be another way. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah. And I think the point that you brought up of observing your mind, I think that is delicious. Like I absolutely love that. And it's something that it took me years and years to be able to develop myself. But I now find that I've practiced enough in observing myself that I can observe myself when I'm being triggered. And I'm like, I'm being triggered right here. Right. It doesn't mean that I can stop the trigger. Let me just put that out there. So, I absolutely don't have my life 100% in order. And I can say that I've mastered that. But it is a process and it doesn't happen overnight. But that observing, especially in business, because business is very triggering, right? All of our fears, all of our insecurities, there's nothing like a business to shine that mirror in front of you and really highlight that. So that observing has come in really, really handy, not only for just dealing with relationships in business, but being able to identify when it's my intuition or when I'm being triggered.
Yeah, I think that's so critical, right? Trigger is a great word. I think one word I use a lot is projections, right? When you're projecting your own experience onto somebody else.
Or activated.
That's when you're activated. For it. Yeah. I think I work with some, startup people, they say going below the line. There's a lot of that, right? It's like essentially when you just get like really tilted. And you're making a decision from that kind of rash emotional place.
Absolutely.
One of the biggest things in my practice that it sounds like, I'd be curious your experience of it as, an individual with ADHD, is switching from, how do I say this? Like generating thoughts to hearing my thoughts, if that makes sense, right? So instead of like making the voice in my head go, it's like sitting and seeing what arises.
Yeah.
I'm curious what your version of that was with your ADHD journey.
So I would say that it's an interesting dichotomy, because as the day goes on and I get more tired, I recognize that those thoughts run off with me. Right. So what I've done is I've cultivated a practice in the morning when I'm fresh, when I'm more, I don't want to say in control, because I don't necessarily believe that we're in control, but when I'm more centered than I am later on in the day and not so much has been going on, to really create an environment to listen. So I literally sit with I have a meditation, prayer, and intuition session every morning that I start off with. I start off with prayer, I meditate for a bit, and then I sit with my intuition and say, what are my messages for the day? What is it that I need to focus on? What is it that I should do or I shouldn't do? Or is there anything that I need to know? Whatever type of thing. And I write it out every morning. And that is my first to-do list of the day. Because what I have found is the more that I surrender into that intuitive guidance when it comes to business, and I call it intuitive strategy from a business perspective, the more I surrender to that, the more in flow I am. And when I'm in flow, my time is about 3 times more efficient and effective than when I'm not. And I'm trying to soldier through and just kind of really push through and force things to happen.
Yeah, so that brings up an interesting question I have, right? So when you're doing your consultation with these businesses and you're trying to bring in intuition, what does an intuitive business look like at scale? And how do you do it for a bigger organization, corporation, small business, something like
So I don't work with corporations. So my area is small business. I find, though, that it absolutely could apply. And I think when you're looking at it, an intuitive strategy from a larger business it's leadership, right? It's the leadership and how they take and work with intuitive strategy themselves, and how they equip their people, their managers and their VPs to work with their intuition. So, the reality is this: running an intuitive business is not for the faint of heart. And I say that because it requires a huge amount of surrender. And it requires you recognizing that you really aren't as in control as you think you are, right? Those 2 words are kind of the polar opposites for a hardcore entrepreneur, right? And so, you see these leaders that go to personal developments and they go to workshops a lot. And I really think it's for them to find, or I would hope it's for them to find that center, because you're really needing to balance that. Going back to my to-do list in the morning. So, I have a business, I have a team. One of my businesses, I run a team of 10 team members, and, we have deadlines and we have things that we need to meet, regardless. My clients aren't going to want to know what my intuition said in the morning. They want their newsletter out at a certain time or whatever that looks like. So it requires a huge amount of trust to be able to surrender that type of enterprise and trust that the guidance that you're getting is going to help that. Because many times I'll wake up in the morning and I'll get like, as much as this is due, don't focus on this today. And I'm like, that's crazy. What do you mean? Like, I have a deadline at the end of the week. If we're not delivering on that, they're like, don't focus on it today. Focus on something else. And I've now learned to listen, because what'll happen is I'll get a phone call at the end of the week or at the end of the day and saying, hey, we're going to have to move that deadline because our part is going to be missing, or someone has to step away. Like, there's always something that actually is like, oh, right. Okay. Yeah. But again, it's that surrender. It really is believing that there is a greater plan at play.
Yeah. I mean, I get chills just thinking of that. I get chills of that being true, and also chills of like fear, right?
Absolutely.
Of letting go of the wheel and not, trying to make things. Because a big part of my entrepreneurship journey was taking responsibility for my life, right?
Yeah.
And the first was business and income, but ultimately became like, what kind of lifestyle do I want? Who do I want to surround myself with? What is my life going to be about? And there was a lot of power and, empowerment in that. There was also a lot of rigid control. It was both. It was like, I need to make things happen. If I want things to happen, I have to be the one driving it. And I imagine that's a very common mindset for entrepreneurs.
Absolutely. Listen, I'm A-type to them. Like, I love my to-do lists. I love to plan a vacation out to the last minute. My husband just despises that about me. So I get it. It's very difficult. But the productivity nut in me really started to analyze when I listened versus when I didn't. Mm-hmm. And the results, at least for me, spoke volumes. And I said, I can't, I have to surrender my ego and recognize that there is something here, whether I understand what's there or not. But if I really want the best for my life and for my business and for my staff and for my clients, really, this is the direction that I need to go into.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And I imagine working with teams, working intuitively, it's also kind of like reading the room, right?
Absolutely.
Because it's being yourself in that sense of flow that you talked about, and having mental well-being, having emotional harmony, having all these things in the workplace. So it doesn't feel like it's people like butting heads or grinding up against each other.
Yeah.
And oftentimes what might be the most pressing need might be something, like you said, very small or even random. But if that blockage isn't clear, then everything else is going to grind to a halt.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that we're starting to see a real shift in society in recognizing the value of that. I think COVID has done a phenomenal job in really highlighting the importance of our well-being as a pillar, and mental wellness in the workspace. For me, one of the cornerstones of mental wellness is that intuition.
Yeah, I think that's really great. I mean, some of the work that I do with companies is more around conflict resolution and team dynamics, group dynamics. And I say very similar things. So like, look, if your group dynamics are off, nothing's going to get done, right? If that thing that people gossip about around the water cooler isn't actually talked about, nothing's going to get done, and the company's going to explode. It's a cancer.
It's a cancer.
It's super
it
toxic.
Absolutely is. Yeah.
And I imagine the intuitive sense can direct you through things like that. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, for sure. And I also think that, the intuitive side is going to take you to the scary parts, the scary conversations. But if we look at it from a well-being standpoint, those are the conversations that we have to have. And I think we're seeing that in the world now. We're having conversations that we should have had a long time ago and we didn't. Naturally there's a part of the population that is uncomfortable with that, because they are uncomfortable. But it's like taking that splinter out. It's going to hurt while you're taking it out, but you're going to be so much better for it at the end.
Yeah. Yeah, I believe that, and I certainly hope that that's where a lot of these conversations
Fingers
go.
crossed, right?
Fingers crossed, right? That, seeing the shadow will help us to purge it, right, and help us to illuminate it some more. So we're going to move into our final commercial break here. When we come back, I want to talk more about neurodiversity. I want to talk more about the spiritual beliefs, and hear maybe some case studies of businesses that you worked with or your own company, and what an intuitive workplace really looks like. So if you're tuning in, thanks for listening this far, and we will keep you on the other side of the commercial break.
Follow us on Twitter at VoiceAmericaTRN. Get the lowdown on guests, new shows, and your favorites. That's VoiceAmericaTRN.
In Mark's work with high performers and business owners, it is becoming increasingly clear to him that their biggest obstacle to success is themselves. They are experts in their field, but are dragged down by their anxiety, poor time management, inability to focus, or self-sabotage. His role is to help you overcome these emotional and organizational issues so that you can truly excel in your business and your personal life. One of the most common hurdles that he sees is perfectionism, a crippling anxiety around performance. It's a fear of not being good enough, being publicly embarrassed, or of disappointing others. These fears paralyze brilliant people and bring them to their knees. This course will help you to break free from this mental prison and have more agency in your world. In this online course, we will break down the prison of perfectionism so that you can break out of it. For more information and to sign up, visit mark-azulay.teachable.com. That's Mark, MARC-Azulay, AZOULAY.teachable.com.
It's your world. Motivate, change, succeed. VoiceAmericaEmpowerment.com.
You are listening to From the Ashes with Mark Azulay. To reach the show today, please call 1-888-346-9141. That's 1-888-346-9141. Or send an email to podcast@mark-azulay.com. Now, back to From the Ashes.
Welcome back to the show. So we were talking during the break about how lonely entrepreneurship can be and the importance of peer support. And you mentioned that you run a peer support program, and I certainly want to hear more about. I think it's just so critical because when I talk to a lot of my startup guys, they talk about how they're always posturing, they're always selling, they're always pitching, they're always seeking investors, or they feel like they have to perform for their team. They feel like they're very disingenuous, actually, most of the time. And a lot of them are, especially in the beginning where you don't know what you're doing. So you're just kind of on stage all the time. So I think talking to other people, other founders, other CEOs can be really critical. Can you say a little bit about your program and about, what comes out of those groups?
Yeah. So I call that the poker face, the business poker face, what you just talked about. And it's one of the modules. So I've created a program called Soul Circles, and it is about prioritizing mental wellness within the founder space. It is a structured program where it is peer support and peer facilitated so that, one, we deal with the loneliness and isolation, but two, we also deal with exactly what you talked about, that posturing, that peacocking, right? No one ever says, I haven't been able to pay my mortgage in 3 months, right? No one talks about all of these really scary things that entrepreneurship it forces us to deal with on an ongoing, regular basis. And so I really wanted to create a program. So I don't run the program. I can, but really I've created it to sell it to venture capital firms, entrepreneur centers, startup hubs, boards of trade, because what's the point of reinventing the wheel when we already go to these places for the support that we need in business? Well, let's make it a little bit more holistic, the support that you get. And it's also a program that's developed not to be run by anyone else but another entrepreneur. Because the reality is we don't respect non-entrepreneurs to tell us what to do, right?
Yeah.
It's like, tell me that when, you've gone bankrupt or you've lost all of your clients because your shipment didn't come in. Like, whatever that scenario looks like, it's very difficult for us to listen to a so-called expert that has never really walked in our shoes. And I think that's valid for a whole bunch of different areas in life. But luckily, with my social work background, I had a great experience in my practicum of working with adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse in running peer support programs. So I really took that, and it was during COVID, because I kept talking to people, and I'm like, no one talks about how lonely this is. Like, I would schedule picking up my dry cleaning in the middle of the day so that I could speak to another human. Pre-COVID, I actually set up like social time to be able to nurture this, this human side of myself, not in front of a computer. And so I kept saying, I wonder why there isn't something that helps this. There's individual help, but nothing really structured that you could, find in different places. And so COVID really highlighted that, because it's unfortunately a really sad story. My husband worked for a very well-known startup founder in the tech space who took his own life in March. And I had been developing the program since November, and I had kind of that entrepreneurial fear of it's not good enough yet. I need better marketing. Like all of those things that came up. And when we got the news, it was like a dagger to my heart. And I said, oh my God, if I had released this, could this have helped? Could this have made a change? And so I said, that's it. This has to go. This has to go. I have to start talking about it. Because so many people are suffering, right? Entrepreneurship has 8 of the major risk factors for suicide are intrinsically built in being an entrepreneur. No one talks about that. You just see the big numbers and the more funding and or Dragon's Den or Shark Tank, how you guys call it in the States. You just see that flashy stuff, but you don't see all the pain and suffering in the back end. So I really wanted to highlight that and provide at least some vehicle to get some help.
Yeah, I think it's a really powerful mission, right? And it is lonely. And I'm in Boulder, which is a lot of tech startups. And the guys I work with are out there comparing themselves to the Elon Musk and the Jeff Bezos and, Mark Zuckerberg's. And that's what the culture kind of props up is entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
But those people are like 1 in a billion, right? Yeah. And most of it, I think, what we've been talking about is like constant failure, loneliness, confusion, right? A lack of leadership because you have to learn it all as an entrepreneur.
Fear, shame, like you name it. The other co-conditions that most entrepreneurs suffer from. 70. What's the statistic according to StatsCan? 73% report suffering from depression at least once a week, right? Yeah. Suicidal ideation, right? Like there's the stats are staggering when you really start to consider, and no one talks about that. It's really something that it's an epidemic. It is an epidemic that I'm shocked we don't actually hear about more. Because people that take this chance and create these wonderful things, they're unique. It is not a true entrepreneur. I feel personally they're born. I'm going to be honest, and whether that's probably controversial, but I really think that they're born. That you're born with that creative fire that. You rather die than stop creating. That's the strength of that fire within. And it is something that is not very common. And when we lose them, what could we lose? The potential that's gone with that is something that we it's not replaceable.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it truly is a creative art. It doesn't matter what industry you're in, but it's like painting on a blank canvas and bringing a part of yourself into the world. Yeah. Right. And that's a good thing and a bad thing because, and I'm curious what you think about this, a lot of the entrepreneurs I talk with, and this was true for me when I was starting my business as well, is over-identification with the business. Because how can you not?
Absolutely.
Right. Like it becomes your life.
Yeah.
So the successes and failures are your successes and failures. And that's, I think it's what it takes in the beginning, but it also is very dangerous.
It's a double-edged sword, right? I say you have to suffer from that condition to become an entrepreneur, but you got to get help for it immediately because just as much as it can make you an entrepreneur, it can take you out as well. When you roll that in with ADHD, that's what I was talking about. It almost becomes obsessive thoughts for me towards the end of the day because you're so engulfed in. So like I'm showering and I'm like, voice memos. I'm like, hey, can you write this down? Like I'm yelling things to my husband because I'm like, I don't want it to all of a sudden be lost in the ethers. And then that idea is gone. I have books and books and books notebooks filled with ideas of things that I want to do. I'm in the car. You name it. I'm washing dishes. I'm serving dinner. All of this is constantly flowing. That can, that is a type of mental illness unto itself, right? So it's a matter of kind of putting those guardrails on that and really setting some boundaries and knowing yourself and saying, okay, this is good, but when it gets to this point, what are we going to do? Because it's clear you need some help or it's not going to be healthy. So, For example, when my house starts to be really messy, I'm like, this is a sign that this is going too far, right? When my eating habits fall off the wagon, this is a sign for me, right? When the laundry starts to pile up, just because of the disciplined person that I am, I know that I'm taking that creativity too far. And it's like, okay, rein it in, bring it some time to, to kind of contemplate, to sit with yourself, to put a pause, to, maybe it's because a project is going on, sure. But like, what's the end date of that? Kind of put a timeline to it so that isn't defining your whole life constantly.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I mean, for me, it's kind of a mental state thing of when I get too scattered, I know I need to slow down. When I feel rushed, when I feel like confused, when I walk into a room and don't know why I'm there, when I have these experiences of just like chaos, I'm like, okay, slow down. Because I am hyper productive, but when I'm in that flow state, which you talk about, it's like, it's feeling a mastery. I feel like I'm dancing. I feel like there's like this beauty to it. There's like an elegance to it.
And there's no mistakes.
Right.
Versus when you're working for the sake of working, you go back and you're like, oh, I got to redo
like, what the heck was that? Yeah. I can't believe I wrote that down.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas, in the chaos kind of scattered, that's where I need to center and refocus. But again, it's in those, and this is, I still make this mistake now, but made a lot early in my career in those moments is when I thought it was the most important. Because it's when I felt like I was running late or I was going to disappoint somebody or, I was going to miss their appointment or I wasn't marketing hard enough. I think you mentioned something like that, right?
Yeah.
Like it's all going to fall apart. That brought up that fear and that anxiety and that chaos, which made it even worse, Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. To me, my goal now, I think since I've turned 40, for me, there's two things. The end goal for everything is peace for me. Mm-hmm. If it's a business decision that causes me any type of like angst, not stress, because I think that there's a fine line of a good stress, but angst where I'm like, I don't want it in my life. Mm-hmm. And two is creating the scenarios that help me reach flow. Mm-hmm. Those two things seem very gentle, but they're actually quite challenging from a discipline perspective to achieve for control freaks. And I consider myself a control freak, and I consider most entrepreneurs to be natural control freaks, right? Because it requires that surrender. But it's so good when you do. When you give in and you see that magic happen in your life, it can take your breath away. And, I think as you get older, those experiences of having your breath taken away are fewer and far between. So if I can create a scenario where I'm having that happen on a regular basis, then that's a win for me, for sure.
Yeah, I really like that you're talking about that because as you're talking, I'm associating to that must come from a place of like real self-love. Mm-hmm. To not want that angst in your life, to not want that pain, to put yourself in environments where you experience flow and connection. Like, that takes a really healthy amount of self-esteem and self-love to really fight for your life in that way, right? To cleave through those obstacles and develop a life that is fulfilling for you.
Well, it's quality of life at the end of the day, right? We work so hard as entrepreneurs. There's just so much that we surrender and we give up for that. So why not make it like, I want to make it worthwhile. I don't want to be like miserable sitting on a pile of money when I'm retiring and being like, no one's around me, but I have all this, like, what's the point?
I scored a lot of points, but I'm alone.
Exactly. I'm alone with like a big house and a nice car. Maybe that's somebody else's cup of tea. That's absolutely not mine.
Yeah. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation. It went by really, really fast.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm shocked actually that it's towards the end now.
Well, as a wrapping up, I'm curious, where can people find you online if they want to learn more about you and the work that you're doing out there?
Absolutely. So you can find me at Book Carolina, just like the state Carolina.com. And that will talk about the podcast that I speak on and all the different projects that I'm currently involved with. Or you can find me on LinkedIn. At Book Carolina or meetcarolina.com is actually, if you just type in Meet Carolina in LinkedIn, you'll be able to find me. And I'm always looking for like-minded people that want to share ideas and and change the world in some way.
That's great. Yeah, very easy to find you online. That's awesome.
Okay.
So thank you so much for joining us. If you're a listener, if you enjoyed this podcast, please share it, like it, put it on social media, give us a 5-star Apple review. We're really getting a lot of those now, which is fantastic. The more that we can get, the more these stories can get out to people and hopefully inspire people to make changes and, recover from their own ashes. So thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next week on another episode of From the Ashes.
Thank you for joining host Mark Azoulay on From the Ashes. Be sure to tune in again live next Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time and 11 a.m. Pacific Time on the Voice America Empowerment Channel, or subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Meet triumph and defeat and treat those two imposters the same.